Now let's have a look at it, that what are the various checks that we need to incorporate. As you can see on the screen, there are 4 types of checks that we can have. I mean, it's not an exhaustive part, but whatever check comes to your mind, that would invariably fall into one of these categories. So the first one out here is the cell check. Now, what is a cell check? Cell check means, as the term itself suggests, it's basically putting a check in a single cell. We are trying to see that if there is a particular computation that I've done at one single place, then there is a cell which includes a check corresponding to it. For instance, just see on the screen that if there is a capital structure assumption that I'm going to put in, so there is a project that I'm going to execute, and that project is going to have a cost of say $100 million. And I have to arrange the funds for it, and I'm going to do the planning for the capital accordingly. So I know as a matter of fact that it's going to come from 2 sources in this particular case. Number 1, it needs to come from debt, and number 2, it needs to come from equity. Now I want to hard code the assumptions related to debt percentage and equity percentage. Alright, so let's say I mention that 65% of the total funding requirement is going to come from debt. Now, if 65% comes from debt, then it is obviously understood that the balance 35% needs to come from equity, right? Because you may, if you're doing a new project and you have in your mind that these are the 2 sources for arranging funds, so it is understood that equity needs to be 35%. So there are 2 ways to put it. One is that I can hard code 35%. And now I've got 65% debt, 35% equity. And it is fine because the total funding is giving me 100% here, which is making sense. But keep in your mind that, there is a possibility that when the end user is going to work on this financial model, that person might say that no, 65% is not the debt that I'm going to raise. I'm going to raise 75% of the total funding requirement from debt. So that person just goes back here and changes the 65% to 75%. Then what happens? As a ground rule, if you are increasing 65% to 75% for debt, then logically you should reduce the equity component to about 25% in this case, which is not happening right now. Now, there is a big possibility that the end user might not even look at this number and he would think that I've done it correctly. I wanted to make debt proportion as 75 and that's what I've done. However, you know that there is a problem in this. So there are 2 ways to handle it. As I said before, one option is that I don't give a choice to the user to hard code the 35%. I would say that whatever debt component input has been taken from the user, pick that up and then put a formula which is 1 minus debt proportion, because if somebody says 65% debt, this formula will automatically give you 35% for equity. If somebody says 75% debt, then this equity gives you 25%, which is going to make it a complete proper equation. That's one way of putting a check. However, I would say that is more like a balance that I'm doing out here, so that the user is given a choice only to provide an input for debt, which we can probably shade in a different color, and compute equity as a side computation for us. We don't allow the user to hard code any input for equity. And just in case you haven't done that, just in case there are multiple sources from where you're going to arrange these funds, then you also have to put some sort of additional checks. Let's have a look at it. Say there is a different scenario wherein I'm going to have debt, equity, and there is some preference shares through which I would be raising some funds. Now what happens in this case? Let me just copy and paste these shaded cells here and say the debt component is going to be 70%, equity component is going to be 20%, and preference shares would be 10%. Now the total is 100%. So because there are three source of funding for us, so we would need to feed in the inputs individually for them. So the user says that 70% needs to go up to 75%. That person changes this to 75%. That person says that equity also needs to go up to about 25%. Now you know that 75% debt, 25% equity would leave nothing for the preference share. So I can probably put preference share as 1 minus debt component and equity component. So once I subtract these two items, then I'm left with 0% here. Now this equation is fine. And if I reduce that 75% to say about 60%, then automatically the preference shares component will become 15%. So now this equation seems to be working fine. However, there could be a small issue in this. Let's say just by mistake, the user enters 50% for equity. Now what's going to happen in that case? 60% debt, 50% equity means preference shares will turn to be minus 10%. Now this is actually a problem. So what we can do? We can include, though we already had a balance in place that the total should not cross 100%, here we can put some cell checks. So I would say there are some cell checks that I'm going to put. And there are two checks that I can think of. Number one, that these percentages that we are going to ask the user to provide, these percentages need to be between 0 and 1. Nobody should be allowed to put a number which is less than 0, and nobody should be allowed to put a number which is greater than 1. So I want to put these two checks for debt and similarly these two checks for equity. So I'll put that check and say that, and check number 1, that this number should be greater than or equal to 0. Whatever input the user will provide, I want to say that it needs to be greater than or equal to 0, comma. At the same time, I would need to make sure that this number is also less than or equal to 1, which is basically 100%. So I'm going to say this cell less than equal to 100%. And see, it's giving me true, and the same check I can put for equity and preference shares as well. So what is going to happen, that you see that there is no problem with debt, there is no problem with equity, but there is a problem with preference shares because that's coming to be negative. And you see that, let me just remove the shading from here because we did not take this particular input as a hard-coded input from the user. We are kind of computing it as a back working, because once you know what is debt, what is equity, you can find out the balancing figure and put that in the third source of funding. So what extra we need to do here? Checks have been included, true, true, false. First thing is okay, second thing is okay, but there is an issue with third. And when you see that third one is showing you a negative figure and hence that is giving you false, you will need to go back and revisit this number, and now it will attract user's attention. It will tell the user that there is some problem here, so that person would look at these three numbers and now it will make sense that debt 60, equity 50 is not possible. So I want to change it. So I will change it over there. I would say that equity can be about 35%. Now it's becoming 5% for preference shares. So that's how these individual cell checks are going to help you. But there can be so many individual cell checks in a financial model. And as I told you that depending on the complexity of a financial model, you could have multiple sheets. You could have 20, 25, 30 worksheets in a financial model. So these individual cell checks are good and they have to be included. But at the same time, we need some sort of a summary also. So that summary is basically the next level of check, which is called a row check. Now, what is a row check? Because typically in a financial model, we work for so many financial years. We could have the next 5 years, next 7 years in terms of projection. So we have so many year numbers in terms of financial projection. So what we do, for each and every year, we would be having a check, and then we can kind of summarize those checks together. And that is precisely called a row check. Let's have a look at this in the Excel sheet. Let us assume I've got these individual checks here, that there is a balance sheet extract wherein I've got two sides. Number one, I've got total assets, right, for say 3 years, like 2021, 2022, 2023. So these are the 3 financial years for which I've created a financial model. And similarly, against the assets, we have got liabilities and equity. Now, as a ground rule from a finance standpoint, the total assets should be equal to total liabilities and equity. So I'm going to put some numbers here and say the total assets is 100, 101, 102. That's how the total assets are going to look like for these 3 financial years. And here for the liabilities and equity, let us assume it is 100, 102 and 101. So this is how the liabilities and equity are looking like in the model. So I'm just putting some cell checks here. Why I call it cell check is because I'm going to put it individually for all of these 3. So I'm going to say that ABS of total assets minus total liabilities greater than 0 is a problem. Equal to 0 is okay. But let's say I'm okay with a certain decimal rounding as well. So I'm going to say that it should be less than equal to 0.001, because sometimes what happens is that total assets would be 100.001 and total liabilities could be 100.0015. There could be a small difference, and that could be on account of some sort of rounding off that we may have done at a couple of places, and that's why we are seeing that gap. So we should be okay with a small error tolerance. In case you do not wish to have that, just make it equal to 0 out here instead of less than 0.001. Otherwise, equal to 0 is also fine if you are too fussy about having the exact figure there. So let's put that formula here and see what it gives me. It gives me true because the delta between 100 and 100 is 0. So it's obviously less than 0.001. Now, let me just replicate this formula on the right hand side. And what does it give us? It gives me false for the second year, false for the third year. So individual cell checks would give me true and false, and I'll be able to figure out which particular year number is having an issue. So I'll go back, rectify the issue for that particular year, and then I will see the true figure coming out here. But the problem is that, right now, there are 3 individual cell checks, and at any point in time I would have to check each and every cell individually. So I would like to summarize all of these cell checks in one single check, and that's technically called a row check. Now you have a choice, because when you work on a financial model, as I said, there are different places wherein these cell checks would have been provided. So you can just dedicate one single column wherein you can put all of these individual row checks. Like I would say that let's use column A for the purpose of putting all row checks. So I would say that if all of these individual cell checks are true, then I should see true for a row check as well. And if even a single cell check in that particular row is having a false value, then I should show row check as false. So what I'm going to do there, I'm going to put equal to, if even there is a single false, I would have a problem. So I'm going to say if countif of this, false. I'm going to talk about countif function, if logic, ABS function, all of that in detail in the Excel refresher topic. However, I'm just trying to tell you how this can be incorporated and why this is important for us. So all of this we will discuss with the help of detailed case studies. But what I'm trying to do out here is I'm saying that just do a counting of how many false values we have got in the individual cell checks. And if that counting is equal to 0, which means that there is no false value. If that counting is 0, then I'm good with it because there is no problem. I would say then call it true, otherwise call it false. And see the result, it gives me false because I've got two values of false out here. And I could have actually summarized this function by removing the if as well. So if you simply say that just do a counting of false and see if it is equal to 0 or not, and that also is going to give you the same result. So what we are saying that just do the counting. If that's 0, we are happy, it will show me true. If it is not 0, then there is a problem. We need to go back and revisit which cell check is causing that issue, and say I just go back, and now this is my row check. Let me just highlight that. Say I go and correct these issues, and I get to see that this is now correct and this is also now correct, and see what has happened. With these individual cell checks showing true values, the row check has also changed to true, and now I'm pretty comfortable. Because if row check is true, it is automatically understood that all the individual cell checks are fine. So that's how you can actually reduce the manual intervention from your side to go and check each and every individual cell check. You just notice what is the value of row check. If it is true, forget about individual cell checks. If it is false, then go back and check which particular cell is causing the issue. So that is the next level of checks that we can put in the financial model. Now, let me just take you back to the overall check detail. Once you have included the individual cell checks at various places in the financial model, and you've also kind of summarized them together to see the corresponding row check as well, then what you need to do, you need to summarize all of those row checks together at one single place. Because imagine there is a sheet which is having so many cells, and I've done working, let's say, in 500 rows or 1000 rows. Now, there could be multiple row checks in that particular sheet. So what we can do, we can include the third level of check. As you can see on the screen, we can have that sheet check in place, which is basically nothing but the summarization of all row checks that we have in a financial model. So what we do over there is we try to figure out if all the row check values are true or not. And there also I would put the same logic to say that just do the counting of all the row checks in terms of false values. So if the count of false values in the column A in our example, which includes all row checks, is going to be 0, that tells me very clearly that there is not even a single row check which is having false. So I'm happy with that. So the way it works is you kind of start with sheet check. You see what is the value of that sheet check. If that is 0, which means the count of the false is 0, then that shows you true. And now you don't have to worry about the individual row checks or individual cell checks. But if there is any sheet check which shows you false, then in that sheet you would need to revisit the individual row checks and figure out which particular row check is showing you false value. And that typically flags out the row number, and you go to that row number on the right hand side, figure out the corresponding cell check to trace the error. So it's a kind of a trail for us. We are able to go to the last level to see the main issue that we have in the model. So we don't have to just go here and there in the financial model. We have a proper flow through which we can audit that particular model. And this does not stop here. Obviously, you have the last level of check here, which is global check. So the way we kind of summarize all cell checks to row checks, and the way we summarize all row checks to a sheet check, similarly, we would have different sheet checks in the financial model. If I have about 25 worksheets in the model, I may have 25 sheet checks as well. So we could have some sort of a table of content wherein we list out all of those 25 sheet checks and then do the counting if all of those sheet checks are true or not. So counting of false over there also should be 0. So what we do over there is that if the count of false in all sheet checks is equal to 0, then global check, or what you can call as a master check, is going to show you true, because then you are saying count of false equal to 0. If the count of false is indeed 0, global check shows you true. So at any point in time, what happens is you have got so many checks in place in the financial model, but you need to only and only focus upon global check. Because in the global check, if you see that it is true, then it is automatically understood that all the sheet checks are true. It is automatically understood that all the corresponding row checks are also true. And that also makes it clear that all the individual cell checks are also true. But if the global check shows you false, then you have to figure out in the table of content sheet that which sheet check is actually false. So out of those 25 worksheets, for instance, if you have in the model, you see that sheet number 5 is showing me false. So you straight away jump to that sheet number 5, you go to that sheet, and then in the row check column, you identify that which particular row check is false. You jump to that row, then take a look on the right hand side and see which individual cell check is having an issue. And that's how you're able to properly trace the error. And that's how you can kind of, properly ensure that the model has inbuilt checks and balances in place. And these checks might sound pretty basic, but honestly speaking, when the complexity of the model tends to increase, then these checks actually help you a lot. It is important for us that we pay proper attention to these checks, because once the model size becomes a little heavy, then as a modeler for us and even the end user might find it a little difficult to manage the complexity of that model if something wrong happens in that file at all. So these checks are actually our best friends when we have to correct the issues in our financial model, right? So just to summarize what we have discussed till now is we have kind of understood now that what is financial model, what we basically do in a financial model, what is the flow of the financial model, and also we have seen what are the checks to be included in a financial model.